But in the Western world, in the US and Europe alike, arms dealer lobbyists were numerous and powerful, and Pakistan was quite the client. In that regard, Massoud was a problem.
Massoud was very good. He convinced them easily. We'll see where that leads in political terms, but I think we're slowly moving forward. A country like Afghanistan is so far removed from the current concerns of European parliamentary representatives. But this is how we'll get things to evolve, through trips like this one. They're tedious to put together, but they're productive.
Safe travels home.
My heart is here with you. So we'll be back. We'll be back to bring you to Paris. And to Washington.
Then when Morillon got back to Strasbourg, he convinced Nicolas Fontaine, the president of the parliament, to officially invite Massoud, which had never been done by anyone, anywhere.
I think France's hands were a little tied by the relationship and economic connections with Pakistan, which was valuable back then. Of course, French intelligence services were in contact with Massoud, the same way they were in contact with the Taliban. They met him regularly to ask questions about the situation, to understand how he saw things, and also to ask questions about Al-Qaeda. That was the major point of interest of the French intelligence services. Given how Massoud had a significant network of informants in the country, he might learn things about bin Laden or Al-Qaeda and share that information with the French. I shared military insights about the Shamali Plain front with French intelligence services, with Massoud's permission. I was a messenger.
The messages transmitted by Western secret services, including the CIA, were eventually heard. Still sparing Pakistan, the Americans decided to put pressure on the United Nations Security Council in New York City. The UN voted to put sanctions in place against the Kabul regime.
Les talibans ne peuvent continuer à faire fi de la volonté de la communauté internationale en soutenant et abritant des terroristes en toute impunité.
The United States was in what I call their hyperpower phase, which meant that basically any other power almost anywhere in the world had to take US policies into account. That didn't mean they needed to agree with those policies. In fact, the French government's position with regard to the United States at that time was to be a friend, an ally, but not necessarily aligned with them. The Americans found that unacceptable, because they thought, if you're an ally, you have to be aligned with them. Otherwise, you're useless.
The moment international sanctions were put into place, I knew they would become even more radicalized. And that the moderate, who were in favor of keeping open the communication channels with the Western world, would essentially no longer have it their way. As a result, it would be the radicals who would seize power. I tried to tell them that. I tried repeatedly.
The radicalization of the Taliban had brutal, inhumane consequences for women. Their rights regressed even further. Women were reduced to nothing, and any suspicion against a woman could lead to her imprisonment, beating, or even stoning.
Thousands have come to the stadium to see a woman die, a woman whose face we'll never see. We only know her as Zarmina. That's her in the middle, between the two female guards. The Taliban leader sentences her to death for adultery. Zarmina's 7 children watched her execution from the stands. Their uncle was the one who pulled the trigger.
Of course, the Taliban tried to provoke me. They couldn't resist the idea of luring me to their side. For example, one time they sent me a beautiful written invitation asking me to honor them by attending a public execution, at Kabul Stadium. That really made my blood boil, and I went in person to return the invitation to the protocol service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which at that point had been reduced to its simplest form. I said, "Take this back. I don't want to keep such an invitation, and I never want to receive another one like it in the future."
Freedom for women? It's false to say that they had no freedom. They were not prisoners. Granted, they did not have Western freedoms, but they had Islamic, Quranic freedoms. And in our country, it's true that stoning, as prescribed by Islam, is allowed.
Women are like ghosts, all shrouded in the same covering, the chadri. These furtive silhouettes were filmed in secret. In Afghanistan, one can't even look at them from behind. And here, even their underwear is a man's business.
Women selling clothes? No way. Islam wouldn't allow it.
Because of this interpretation of the Quran, in Afghanistan, women's fashion is entirely decided by men, from the cut of the pattern to the actual models.
You know, when you own a rare pearl, you don't just leave it lying around. You keep it safe in a beautiful box. You find a very beautiful box and you keep it inside because it's very valuable. Women in Islam are like pearls. They are valuable, much more so than they are in the Western world. Here, a man must serve his wife. I, myself, am a servant. My wife is at home, along with my daughters, and I serve them. Thanks to us, women do not have to work. Women's rights are protected by Islam. The Shadri also protects them.
Before the Taliban arrived in Kabul, women played a major role in Afghan society. They held 80% of administrative positions and a third of medical jobs. Massoud encouraged equality and advocated women's return to public life.
Massoud believed Islam's fundamental values that give women a space and the right to have an education. They fully belong in the organization of political life. And I think Massoud pushed for those ideas. Women's groups came to him, asking him to sign a charter for women's rights, which he did. He was fully aligned with everything they brought up. He agreed with all of it. Yet he still added a line about how these clauses had to respect Afghan culture.
Another indication of the Taliban's radicalization was their desire to destroy all non-Islamic symbols. After forbidding children to play with kites, to listen to music, and to take photos of themselves, they now opposed looking at any work of art.
The Afghan government, with help from France and a protocol signed in 1921, had promoted national archaeology. By destroying Afghan archaeology, the Taliban wanted to prove that Afghanistan had no culture other than that instilled by the Pakistani seminaries.
To access these beautiful works carved in the rock, one must take tunnels that lead to an opening above them, where one discovers beautiful frescoes that have already been vandalized with a view to the country's organized art trafficking. This past Sunday, authorities in Kabul tried to reassure a Western diplomatic team who had come to investigate the destruction of artworks.
Just 2 hours after our last meeting, Mullah Omar announced the decision to systematically destroy all anti-Islamic works. Why? Of course, there were obvious ideological and religious reasons. To them, these statues represent idols and must hence be destroyed. But that's also a clear sign of radicalization. I contacted the Minister of Foreign Affairs and I told him that if they did this, they needed to understand that their image would forever be destroyed. Stoning women was hard enough to swallow. But here you had something that had been around since the 5th century, and which wasn't bothering anybody. I said, look, if you're really afraid that people will come and worship these statues, I'm sure I can find you a company somewhere that would be willing to manufacture and donate curtains. You can cover the statues and just open the curtains when people come to observe their splendor, as opposed to worshipping them. He said, what a great idea, and that he would relay it to Mullah Omar. He promised me that those Buddhas wouldn't be destroyed. He gave me his word.
When you play the diplomatic game, you're faced with two types of fanatics. There's the one who doesn't really believe, so you can negotiate with him. Then there's the fanatic who really believes. How can you negotiate with that? And how can you tell one from the other? And which one would you prefer?
I only found out what happened months later, after September 11th, from an Afghan friend. He told me the day we left Mutawakil's office, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, he immediately picked up the phone and called Mullah Omar in Kandahar, the supreme leader of the Islamic Emirate, and told him he had given us his word, and so on. It turns out that Osama bin Laden was in Mullah Omar's office at the time, and he said, don't you think that would be an embarrassment? These foreigners are willing to spend millions to install curtains or build a wall around the Buddhas, while our people are dying of starvation, and they won't even lift a finger to help them. That's shameful. We need to destroy all that crap, those pieces of stone. And that's what happened. All of our appeals were unfortunately totally useless.
The Taliban's relentless destruction of the Bamiyan Buddha statues in March 2001 was a huge shock, because it revealed an extremely deep-seated way of thinking, which is why the world reacted. It represented a resurgence of a way of thinking that we thought we were done with in our world. This thought that monuments and works of art from civilizations that are not our own carry ideological messages and pose religious dangers, which is why they must be completely eradicated.